Are you overwhelmed by the challenge of personalizing communication for thousands of students? That's where Element 451's AI assistants come in. From nudging prospective students to guiding those already on their journey, AI assistants don't just automate, they write, build, and optimize every step of your digital campaigns. Discover how at element451.com/AI team.
Welcome to Mastering the Next, a cutting-edge podcast that explores the future of graduate, online, and non-traditional education through the lens of AI and technology. I'm your host, Dr. Ray Lutsky, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Element 451. Join me for discussions with some of the thought leaders shaping the future of graduate enrollment management through technology. Mastering the Next is a part of the Enrollify Network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform that helps institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. In recent years, the conversation around the value of higher education in the U.S. has intensified, with concerns about the mismatch between curriculum and job market demands, rising tuition, and inefficiencies such as low graduation rates. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Ladany, president of San Francisco Bay University, to explore these unspoken realities of American higher ed, drawing from his thought-provoking Forbes piece, What We Never Say Out Loud in Higher Education. Dr. Ladany will shed light on the hidden challenges and hard truths shaping the future of universities. Welcome to the podcast, President Ladany.
Thank you, Ray. It's great to be here.
So what's next for higher education in acknowledging and addressing these unspoken challenges that often go undiscussed within institutions?
That's a great question. I think, to me, it's almost getting back to our roots, although not the rotten roots, but the roots really of what higher education was meant to be, which is all about the student. I think higher ed has lost its way because it's become less about the student, more about faculty, more about staff, administrators, athletics, all the things that are not around specifically the student. And imagine if we could build a university that says student-centered is first and everything around it has to be built with that perspective. And that's what we're trying to do here. I think largely universities may have had that mission initially. They kind of talk about it in an ancillary fashion, and I'm happy to share with you certainly more details as to what that is about, what that means to me. But I think universities have not been there, and we kind of do it on the side rather than as the center.
That touches on some of the things you mentioned in your Forbes piece. You highlight some of the difficult truths you just talked about. How do you believe institutions can start addressing these issues openly? Like, for example, being more student-centered versus more research and faculty-centered. How do you begin that conversation?
Well, I think it's a hard conversation because, like any delusion that's kind of cemented in a system, it's hard to break down that delusion, those delusional barriers. But to me, it goes back to being unafraid to ask the questions as to why we're doing X, Y, or Z. Why, for example, are faculty in charge of the curriculum? It makes no sense whatsoever to have a group of individuals who've never been trained in curriculum development to quote unquote own the curriculum. So, faculty, and as I said in other places, that faculty need to be trained in teaching. There is no other industry in the world where your primary workforce has never received training in the job we ask them to do. Yet in higher education, that is largely what we've done with faculty, is we said, hey, you've got a degree, now teach with the best pedagogies out there without them ever even knowing what the word pedagogy necessarily even means for them. And so I think, the big piece for me is start with those center most important things around student education. Teaching's one. We want our faculty to know how to teach. So we need to train them how to teach. And we need to have curriculum experts decide what is the best curriculum and the best learning and teaching activities that are out there. Number two, wraparound services around the students. We can't just assume that, we're going to have a counseling center, for example, with session limits, and that's going to do the mental health, that's going to be sufficient for the mental health needs of the class or the students. I always say that, these session limits, which you often see on higher education institutions, or 6 sessions are the limits to what you can seek mental health for. Well, for some students that might work. For others, there's no way it'll work. It's like giving aspirin for cancer. And so universities have to start looking at offering unlimited mental health services, which is what I've done at places that I've been. And not only is it the right thing to do, it's actually a good business approach, because if a therapist can save 2 to 3 students, depending on the university, from leaving, the university will save money because those students, it's actually beneficial to the university from a net revenue perspective. And I guess I'll say the third thing, although there are a lot more, but the universities need to relook at their business models. Their business models make no sense in the current day, what students need these days. And so if you ask any business person how higher ed operates, give them a spreadsheet of the university budget, they will be typically aghast. And part of the delusion is to make sure that people who are around those, looking at those budget models, kind of can say, okay, it's not the way I would do it, but okay, they're doing it that way. But the problem, of course, is that now universities are being held accountable more, because when their tuition has dropped because we have our demographic cliff hitting this year, we also had COVID, we also had FAFSA. That's why we're seeing right now one university close a week. And the folks I've spoken with who are in this realm in terms of whether they're consultants or working at universities, you'll hear universities, whether it's faculty, staff, administrators, trustees, will say, without either consciously or unconsciously, but they're basically saying, I would rather close than change what I do, without any regard to how that affects students or even their own jobs. But we're still seeing it. And, universities have to change what they're doing around the business of higher education.
Rationally, what you just said makes complete sense. Looking at the data, it is self-evident. From your perspective, how did we get to this place where we're not willing to have these discussions, the barriers that have been put in place over time? How did this come to be that we're in a place where everything you just said, from being student-centered to providing resources to training students to be in demand, is somehow foreign and in fact maybe anathema to an institution? How did we get here?
Yeah, I think there are a number of factors, but one of them is the rising cost of tuition was not held in check. So everyone had to buy the next rock climbing wall or the next waterfall on campus. There's a university that just went out of business recently that put a lake on campus, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a lake, and then they go out of business. It's this idea, this belief that the shiny objects are what are going to bring students. Well, that's just not the case. It can't work that way. Athletics is the other thing. I've heard folks now bring football back, but they don't count all the things that go around the cost of bringing athletics back. It's not just having a team. It's the coaches, it's the athletic facilities, it's the fields. All of these are hundreds of thousands of dollars, such that the student athletes end up getting a much bigger discount in tuition than other students. And so those other students end up paying for these athletic facilities that very few students use. The golf team is another good example. And so instead of offering all these services just to student athletes, offer it to all the students. And it will cost much less if all students got this. So what happened was, it became this arms race to see who could offer the best rock climbing wall. And the the universities with large endowments, they could play that game. But universities with smaller endowments, and what I mean by that is smaller, anything under 100 million, let's say. And that sounds like a lot, but it's really not a lot. But an endowment, because a lot of it's restricted, a lot of it has conditions, and even in those cases, it's not enough to sustain those increases in tuition, because along with increases in tuition came a discounting of tuition. So it was the retail price versus the sales price. And right now, the average discount, and most people don't realize this in outside of higher education, but the average discount's over 50%. Meaning if you have a $40,000 tuition, most students are only paying $20,000 a year. And eventually that catches up to you. So when you start getting up into the 60, 70 plus percent, it's a meaningless number, that tuition retail price. It's very much a blue light special at a lot of institutions. So they don't have the wraparound services. They, decrease the number of student advisors they have for students. They expect faculty to do less because they pay them less. And all of that kind of feeds on itself. So I think it's a multitude of factors. And I will add, trustees who are overseeing the university aren't able to discern what's really happening, because it's often clouded in this murkiness. And then it's like, oh, we just need more student numbers. Well, it's not about student numbers. It's also about net tuition revenue. It's also about how do we ensure that our students are getting the services they need in order to graduate. Because if you're losing half your students or less, which a lot of universities do in terms of retention and graduation, I think sometimes higher ed is more akin to the cigarette industry or the tobacco industry. If you're going to lose half your clients in 2 years, you need to just have a huge, robust admission structure to make sure you're getting those new customers in the door, which is what universities are doing. We have these huge admission structures. We pay millions on admissions, but we pay comparably very little on student retention. And the numbers show it, basically. When you have average percentages, sometimes the percentages, some universities are as low as 20, 30% graduation rate. And the last thing I'll say about that just graduation rate is you've got you've now got most universities reporting a 6-year graduation rate. Imagine, the numbers are even stated in the average 4-year college 6-year graduation rate is whatever. And, I wrote an article, and one of the things I said about it is only in college does 4 equal 6. I also think that universities, whatever marketer decided that 6-year graduation rate is the new metric for universities, was brilliant, because basically they muddied the waters enough to make it look like a university is doing well. And by the way, now they're starting to look at 8-year graduation rates as a norm. Well, that's just ridiculous. And to me, a 4-year graduation rate for a 4-year college should be the norm, should be expected. And if the rates aren't hitting 70, 80%, the university is not doing what it says it should do.
It's incredible when you think about it that way. If a business were to focus on acquiring new customers but not satisfying the needs of those customers, were a business to arbitrarily adjust its own key performance indicators to decide what is good and what is not without any sort of a subjective viewpoint, without really good financial clarity or stewardship, that business would be out of business pretty quickly. And I think that's what you're kind of alluding to with all these college closures. What role does transparency have in evolving this and making this better when it comes to those financial challenges? You can see that when some schools close, exactly what you just said, it happens. The school says, well, we thought we were going to have that one big, great class coming in, and it didn't happen. And then, oh, by the way, we didn't tell anybody we're closing this year, but we're closing this year. That's clearly the opposite. But what is the role of transparency? What is the right level of transparency when you're going through that kind of transformation or looking to sort of sound the alarm? How transparent should you be as an institution?
Well, I like that question a lot, because in part it focuses institutions on what they should be transparent about. And to be fair, most universities are telling everyone what they're doing. It's not like they're not sharing it to some extent, but no one's cobbling it together. U.S. News and World Report is a very bad example for what makes for a good university. But if you want to understand whether a university is healthy, look at, you need people to look at their finances. You can get some of that through the 990s or through some of their audited financials. But most parents aren't, first of all, going to dive that deep or look at that very seriously, because it's hard to understand what universities are doing. But universities should have metrics that are standard expectations. Graduation rate's one variable. You're never going to get 100% because you don't expect every student necessarily to graduate. But if you were to take a university and say, what would be the right percentage of graduation? I think 80% is probably a reasonable expectation for a university in 4 years to make. If they can't do that, we need to understand why, but you can't put it on the student. That's what I hear a lot. Well, we didn't have the right students coming in, or the students aren't as prepared as they used to. Well, then prepare them. That's the job of the instructor. But if you've got a workforce that doesn't know how to teach, largely doesn't understand what teaching is about and what are best practices in pedagogy, well, you put them at a disadvantage, and you put the students ultimately at a disadvantage. So I think it's almost like go back to the basic metrics of what are reasonable expectations and then build a university that way. If you're going to spend millions on football or on athletics, there better be outcomes that are related to that, and not outcomes that result in the general student population having a lower graduation rate. Because we hear this a lot too, and it's like a sleight of hand in a way. Oh, our student athletes graduate at a higher rate. Well, yeah, they do, but they have had more resources given to them. They've had the wraparound services. They've had the coaches. I would say give everyone the coaches. Then you'll see everyone's graduation rate goes up. But you're not going to, it's not going to be as easy, because then you have to pay for it all. But if you have to pay for it all, then what does that mean in relation to what we're actually spending money on at universities, which is the other thing. It costs more to staff a rock climbing wall than it does a therapist in the counseling center, which is crazy, but that's what universities do. So it goes back to what are those priorities? To me, wellness is very important, and that's for all students, not just our student athletes, but that's mental health, physical health, spiritual health, nutritional health. All of that is around wellness. Comprehensive wellness should be part of universities, not as an ancillary function, and other things like that as well.
I want to get to talking about what you're doing specifically at San Francisco Bay University, because there's some really innovative things you're doing. But before that, I want to double click on something you said around faculty. And you're a faculty member. I'm a faculty member, so we can have this conversation honestly. But sometimes one of the greatest challenges of initiating that kind of change and that business sense and looking at the models of student service can be working with your faculty. In particular, the point you made about, well, I wasn't the reason the students weren't successful. It was the students. That's the reason why they weren't successful. And yet that's the instructor who was supposed to help those students be successful. How do you navigate those conversations around working with faculty, particularly in the face of what is regarded as faculty governance, the idea that faculty feel they should be in charge of what's happening for a lot of things happening at the institution, even if, as you pointed out, they may not be trained in that particular area?
Yeah, it's a complicated answer to that question. I think, the example I use, and you hear a lot of this these days, academic freedom. I have academic freedom to teach as I want. Well, I use this example in one of the articles I wrote recently, which is we don't train surgeons in biology and then let them perform surgery based on medical freedom. We actually expect them to do something. And in the same way, faculty should be held accountable. And a lot of times administrators are afraid of faculty. I don't think we should be afraid of faculty. I think the vast majority of faculty want to do well. I think there are usually about a third of the faculty. You get these loud voices in the room that have been there for decades, have not been held accountable or pushed for lack of accountability. And we acquiesce to their loud voices. And what I think we need to do is be fearless, because I do think there's about a third of the faculty that are terrific, and they've learned to teach, and they teach exceedingly well. But we need to honor what they do. We need to give them raises, merit raises. We need to give them salary increases. We need to pay them top dollar. That's the other thing. We need to pay them top dollar to do the job they do. But we don't need to pay top dollar to people that are no good. And you can do that with shared governance and faculty governance. But the lanes have to be clarified. And when those lanes are clarified, or what do faculty, should they be doing, most faculty understand accountability is important, because frankly, most faculty, where I see faculty burnout is when they see their colleagues not working very hard, and they're the ones working the hardest, and they're getting the same raise as the person down the hall. And that's a real problem in higher education. So we do need to have an honest discussion about faculty accountability. And, when I've been, places I've been, basically what I've said is to the faculty, let's create an evaluation system for faculty. And frankly, let the faculty create that evaluation system. And typically, those evaluation systems have been even more rigorous than anything I would put together. But the difference is, once you have that accountable system in place, or that evaluation system in place, then you have to adhere to it. Then you actually have to hold faculty accountable based on that system. So you can't let them get away with the nonsense that you sometimes see. I've heard faculty, I can tell you story after story of every university I've ever been at, and certainly any faculty member who's been at any university will tell you about some of the nonsense that occurs. I was at a Research One institution, and one of my faculty mentors told me, point blank, teach well enough not to embarrass yourself. Imagine that is the metric for faculty teaching. That's at a Research One institution. By the way, those tend to be higher on the U.S. News or World Report, because we don't care about faculty teaching, we care about faculty research. But let me also say, faculty research is also something we don't hold faculty accountable to. So it's all about faculty accountability. It's being fearless, but also being transparent and honest with faculty when they're doing well and then when they're not doing well. And when you do that, the faculty that are really good teachers actually appreciate that you've held everyone accountable, or they've held each other accountable, which is largely what happens. So I think there's other things certainly that we can do around faculty accountability. But I think that's probably the place to start, is to have an honest conversation of what are the expectations, what are the criteria, and what are the expectations. That's, last thing I'll say about this, the whole idea of tenure and promotion, it's really quite unscientific. We talk about scientific approaches to most things, but when it comes to faculty tenure and promotion, many universities basically throw up their hands and say, well, whatever the senior faculty think, they can influence the process, because our criteria and expectations are not very clear. You should be able to know how you're doing every year based on a set of criteria and expectations. And if you see that, you should get tenure. There should be no, I'm a senior faculty member, I can play with this in a way that affects your well-being and your professional life, which I've seen a lot at places.
You're referring to what I jokingly call one of the last bastions of medievalism in American higher education, and really speaks to the transformative change you've been able to instigate at the places you've been a leader. And as president of San Francisco Bay University, I'm curious if you could share some of the examples of how you're working to address any of these unspoken challenges, some of the initiatives you've implemented, some of the success you've seen.
I've actually looked at a half dozen to a dozen different kinds of initiatives, broadly speaking, that we think are important. One is around training faculty, giving them the opportunity to learn how to teach, and give them the opportunity. What does it mean to be an engaged teacher? What does it mean? What are the kind of learning activities you need to do in the classroom? If you're still lecturing in 2024, you're probably doing a very poor job. There's very few faculty that are that dynamic that can lecture for an hour to 2 hours to 3 hours every lecture and engage students. It's just not going to happen. So stop with the nonsense. Let's figure out what works. And there are a good dozen, plus or minus 5 different types of things you can do as a faculty member that we've developed, that we have training faculty in what to do. We're also going to hold faculty accountable, and we're expecting them to develop relationships with students. So our faculty are paid top dollar. They're expected to be here year-round, so our students can take courses year-round, and they're expected to do well in their teaching, and teaching is the number one activity for them. There's a lot of this scholarship that happens nationally that's really largely worse than useless at many institutions that I've seen. Leave the big research to the R1s. That's fine. Don't ask them to teach, but ask them to do research. That's fine. They're not going to be any better teachers. We're going to be the better teachers. So that's one big area is we're looking at teaching, training teachers, and how to teach. We've also redone the core curriculum for our students with 21st century competencies that we expect of them and we expect of all of us. And these competencies have been mapped with industry leaders to look to see, is this what you want us to graduate our students with in terms of these competencies? And we'll hold students accountable. Our core curriculum is 30 credits, 30 credits of courses, not a menu of you take sociology, psychology, biology, but 30 credits on telling your life story that integrates communication, psychology, biology. We're going to integrate all of these courses across the curriculum. We expect our students to take those courses. We expect our faculty to teach in those courses. So we're teaching them how to teach our core curriculum. So when our students graduate, they're going to not only get jobs, they're going to be able to modify and generalize those experiences into future jobs that we don't know about at the moment. So the core curriculum is a big area. We're looking at wraparound services around wellness. Comprehensive wellness is another good example. We are basically saying you need to have unlimited mental health counseling services. You need nutritional help, medical, physical, spiritual, financial literacy is really critical, and career literacy. So we're really saying there are avocational or these extracurricular activities that and experiences and competencies we often see as ancillary at universities are core to what we're trying to do with our students. So they're going to get all of that. We operate with a business model where our students pay less than $8,000 a year in tuition. That's pretty extraordinary, and we think that's going to be, we can do it. We have a 5-year plan as we increase our enrollment to make sure that we are fiscally sound in the next 5 years as we work like a startup, frankly. And by the way, all our initiatives, we are open to saying, if this doesn't work, course correct and fix it. We can fix and change things on a dime here. We don't have to go through hundreds of approvals and major bureaucracy on changing. I mean, there are places where if you want to add a course, you have to go through multiple layers of faculty approvals. Well, that's just not 21st century. That might be 16th century. Okay, so good. Go back to the 16th century and you can do what you want to do. But until that time machine is built, let's operate in the 21st century. And that's what I'm really trying to push out there. So those are a lot of things. We're partnering with folks in industry. We're fortunate that we are in the heart of the Silicon Valley. So we have a lot of corporate partners, industry partners that we're linking with. We have our signature scholarship program, which is our Startup Scholars, which is we have about 15 students who have free tuition, free room and board, and a $10,000 package or $10,000 fund to develop their own passion project or startup company. And we think this kind of stuff is what students want these days. And even if you're not a startup scholar, there's opportunities for folks here to be innovative in this space as students, because we all know that students nowadays are entrepreneurs, they're innovators. Let's tap into that. Let's not try to mold them in what we think is the proper types of education that we provide them. So those are just a handful of things that we are doing. I will say one other thing that's important is we're capping our classes at 20. So our students, a big part of what we do is what we're calling developing multiple meaningful relationships, meaning faculty, staff, administrators, our board members are part of all of this. We are here to develop relationships with students that allow them to graduate because we think there's a threshold number of meaningful relationships that allow them to retain and graduate. So part of that with faculty is we're going to say, you're only going to teach 20 students at most in any class, from the first class all the way to the end class that they take. Now, it'll be a lot less than 20 as they go through, as we know in these upper division classes. But 20, we feel, is the optimal high number or optimal maximum number that we can use to have effective teaching take place. And the proof is going to certainly be in the pudding, but we will see.
Well, we look forward to seeing, and it sounds like incredible transformational change and certainly flying in the face of a lot of what's going on in American higher education today. Really incredible. President Nick Ladany, San Francisco Bay University. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. The Mastering the Next podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea and feature a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Artis Cadieux, J.C. Bonilla, Mallory Wilsey, Brendan Henkel, Brian Gross, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.